So today I present boldly the biggest topic I ever discussed on a YouTube video, and you will forgive me if I if I decide to put myself into this trouble. Today I would like to talk about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. And in order to do this, I also have to address the figure of Gregory the Great, uh, Roman Pope, who was the major author of this Christianization. And as you know, this particular event shaped not only the fate of England and of Britain, and it can't be seen just as, as a normal evangelization, as it had occurred already in many other Germanic peoples in the years before, because the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons was incredibly important for European history to come. And think, for instance, about the evangelization of other Germanic peoples through the Anglo-Saxon missionaries, for instance, into the 8th century Carolingian Empire. And a lot of cultural influences coming from the Anglo-Saxon monastic traditions really shaped the history of Europe as we know it today. And in order to speak about this topic, and we obviously have to go back a bit of how the whole thing happened and which were the premises of the um, uh, evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the first missionaries that had to they had gone to Christianize the Anglo-Saxons were the monks of Rome, who were sent, in fact, in 596 by Gregory the Great. That is this great figure in early medieval history, one of the most amazing personalities, indeed, even of the whole Christian history, in the history of papacy, indeed. And Gregory is an extraordinary figure, obviously, for his own intelligence, but you have to understand his intelligence on the base of his background, his political, cultural, social background. Um, Gregory the Great, as Pope, as Pope Gregory the First, he was Pope from 590 to 603 when he died. He had already been a monk himself before becoming Pope, in fact, and he was originally of a great senatorial, a Roman senatorial family. Gregory hadn't started as a clergyman initially. He was firstly at the beginning a civic officer. He was a magistrate in Rome. So he rose up in a lay context, and this lay context is very important because Rome is definitely not the last city in the world at the time, and even if obviously it had decayed from the times of the empire, but Rome is the center as of the Byzantine Duchy of Rome that felt quite strongly the imperial power. We talk about Byzantines as something had changed, but telling the truth, Rome had always remained into the hands of the empire, except during the Greek Gothic War, but essentially, Rome and the surrounding areas, in spite of all the crises of the plague that exactly in the 6th century had struck Italy and the whole Western world, telling truth, the Justinian plague had made a lot of, had really modified the outlook of that whole Western world, and Rome had changed, but substantially the continuity with the Roman imperial authority was always there. We don't have to think about a southern Europe that at a certain point breaks with the empire. The empire was present into Italy at that point, and not only. There were sects of Roman presence in southern Spain, as well as in southern Gaul even. There were cities in southern Gaul that were still minting imperial money and imperial coins. That is quite fascinating. So it's indeed an empire that is fading, because this is a moment of real of decadence of the whole Eurasian civilization in a certain way, because the plague had done really a lot of damage, and it was a sort of regression. We are at the beginning of the early Middle Ages in this period that has been called improperly the Dark Ages, but aside from lack of sources, there wasn't really anything strictly dark, and probably from these people's perspectives, in spite of important um, cesura, in meaning, important um, changes that had taken place. However, the people saw still a lot of continuity with the past, and Rome was indeed still an imperial city, and not just a simple city. It was still, he had the primacy of religious honor, that had been given to it. It wasn't already the papal center as we would know it from the 11th century onwards. This is a time in the Christian world in which theoretically even the metropolitic seats were conceived to be equal in terms of hierarchy, and Rome being the tomb of the apostles, as Peter and Paul, had obviously this religious primacy, but there was no primacy in the organization of a church like the one that would have been created by the popes in the low Middle Ages. There were imperial soldiers in Rome. It was a very multicultural city already at that time, and we will see how that was even reinforced into this period, and how this eventually influenced the same Anglo-Saxon Christianization in part. But we have to think of Gregory the Great as a man who, basically being part of the Roman aristocracy, was perfectly aware of the world of that time. He knew what happened in Constantinople. He knew what happened in the rest of Europe. He was an highly educated man. And he was a very clever one as well, and very well inserted into the political net. Also, because you couldn't become a pope if you didn't have political connections. That sounds grim from a spiritual point of view, but maybe it is also allowed very smart men to reach Peter's soil and to organize the church also in pragmatic terms, better than maybe more spiritual popes that instead maybe weren't that great at doing that. And however, we see that from this mundane life, Gregory, at a certain point, from a layman, becomes something, not just a clergyman, but also an ascetic. He He basically transformed his own father's house into a monastery. Mhm. And this is very important. Whoever knows archaeology in early medieval Rome, we know that a lot of patrician domus were transformed into this period into monasteries. It wasn't something that was born out of pure religious needs. It was really something much deeper, and it was part of a political project. Definitely so the importance of the Bishop of Rome rising into the political landscape of the time. And Gregory was definitely the leader in this process. Um, and in fact, even if he had chosen a ascetic life, in telling the truth, he followed this monastic ideal that came from tradition of privation and and sufferance. He still participated to political life, and in fact he became before, this is obviously all before becoming pope, he became the papal ambassador at Constantinople. Now you can imagine how important this title, which was the one of Apokrisarios in Greek, if I'm not wrong. Um, the Byzantines had these titles that quite often at that time maybe had this originary name, or maybe some office that was created into the late Roman Empire. This time the functions of these functionaries, of these officials, were a bit changed, in certain cases even broadened. I think the Apocrisarius was originally, the one who looked at the imperial treasure, but I wouldn't like to say something stupid. But at this point, at this time, this this title meant that he was an ambassador. So you can imagine how a very powerful Roman aristocrat could go in Rome and could go to Constantinople and dealing with the very important affairs of the relation, the political and religious relations between Constantinople and Rome, which weren't quite good, because Rome obviously always, even in this time of relative decadence, always said, we are the real center of the empire, dear Constantinople. We even have, since this is a Christian empire, the primacy, religious primacy of in the whole empire. So you should be listening what as bishops of Rome would tell you. And there was a lot of backfiring in this sense, but there were also a lot of common interests. Also, because you have to think that at that time the Mediterranean wasn't closed at all. The Arab invasions hadn't taken place. There had been a sharp decline in trade, but overall the routes, the trade routes and communication ways were still opened, and especially in these coastal areas of Italy, such as the one of Rome is, there was a lot of contact with Constantinople, and it was quite easy to reach from there. The Italian inland was instead already conquered by the Longobards, and it was taking very different developments. Yet cities like Rome always had this privileged bond with the Byzantines, at least as long the Byzantines could reach them, meaning that even think of having a fleet. That really meant how influent you could be all over the Mediterranean. At a certain point, the Byzantine Empire has a crisis, especially with the Arab invasions. So this brought obviously the Italian Byzantine territories to get a high degree of autonomy, and this is also the landscape in which you have to think of the papal power building up its own prerogatives, initially a bit modestly, also because they Western Europe was was really um, asphytic at that time in terms of resources, investment, and stuff. So, but you know, men like Gregory the Great really embody, this papal prestige that was being structured into Western Europe. Um, let's say, in at least in competition with Constantinople, not in opposition yet, but there was some sort of enmity. Um, and this was perfectly normal in the times of Gregory. I mean, the idea of Roman aristocracy still belonging to the affairs and still owning duties of civil government and ecclesiastical government at the same time. This is also very important because the popes were de facto ruling Rome already. They owned a lot of properties. They controlled the city. They fed the city. Gregory the Great was quite crucial in this. One of the major problems of Rome, that was still a large city by those times standards, was to be fed, and therefore they made the church had the grain coming from Sicily, and and trying a lot of stuff just to keep the government of this city up, which was definitely not easy at that time, as in others, telling the truth. And therefore, what you see in this, it's not just a civil and religious commitment, but also an intellectual commitment. As we have seen, Gregory was a highly educated man. He kept, in a certain way, into the same monastic tradition, the ancient intellectual pagan tradition of the otium. That is basically, or otium, like you wanna pronounce it into the different Latin pronunciations. At that time, they probably already didn't speak the ancient, the classic Latin pronunciation. The otium or otium was essentially this. It's not really easily translatable. It's a sort of, today it has a negative meaning. You can translate that with idleness, or laziness even, in that sense. But in the Latin meaning of the word, it was basically a retirement during which the intellectual could read so far away from the outside world. The ancient Roman aristocrats would simply go in their villas out of Rome, that was a quite crowded, nosy place, and do their otium there. At this time, Rome was a bit less crowded, probably still noisy, but a man like Gregory could find his otium into his same monastic life. And this it meant that he had a great interest in the letters, even in the ancient orders, and obviously centrally with the fathers of the church, but still seeing, the classical past, at least in front of his eyes, because Rome was still there and largely unspoiled, at least compared to what we can see, how we can see her now. And in fact, when Gregory became Pope, he continued his writing activity. He was a quite prolific writer. He wrote as something. Gregory's work is one of the most fascinating, lucid, and intelligent that you can find. Even his letters to the emperors. He was a really great man, and he usually had. He had different aims, and you can see how polymatic he was. He had sort of pastoral production for his sheep, for the believers, for the Christians. of his bishopric, and it was the one of Rome. He was an expert also in Bible exegesis, that is critical interpretation. So he was a skilled theologist. And he, however, at the same time, was quite busy in these administrative tasks, and especially managing the literally immense estates of owned by the Roman Church already at that time. And as we were saying, also in dealing with civil administration to keep things right within the city, and to feed the people of Rome, and also in dealing with other external problems that were also quite important. At the time of Gregory, it was the Tricapitoline schism that derived essentially from a position that Constantinople had taken in order, to keep a balance between, the heretic communities and all the troubles that Constantinople had. From that point of view, in order to keep as many communities as possible within the empire that was becoming fragile, and Rome, in this sense, and it's very interesting from this point of view that the Longobards, that were Arians at that time, however, defended the position of the Roman Church against the one of Constantinople. Both a bit because they were at war with each other, but also because well, technically they were enemies with Rome, also the point, but also because in their simplicity they didn't like the Byzantine sophistry regarding all these religious gaming to keep a sort of ambiguity between heretic and unorthodox positions to appease certain provinces of the empire. And the same Rome, from this point of view, sided with Longobards. I mean, they said, these guys are right, and we are the ones who, as popes, who can really see that. And we must say that especially in the early Middle Ages, Constantinople tried over and over again to make these tricks, and Rome was quite orthodox, quite well orthodox in comparison, quite logic, quite linear. They never gave up to the intellectual purity of the Bible interpretation, and refused all the heresies that at that point were spreading because of the Roman imperial political games. The Italic episcopate was quite unitary in this sense, even if the Tricapitoline schism also implied that there were different cities within the same Italy that sided instead from the Byzantine side, probably also because they were more directly under Byzantine control, something that Rome, as we've seen, wasn't. That was, but up to a certain point, and without popes, the Byzantines could definitely not control, at least formally, the city. And in this sense, it's very interesting also what Gregory did with Longobards. We are talking about. I've been talking for 24 minutes. I haven't still introduced the Evangelization, the Anglo-Saxons. But it's very important from that perspective as well to see how Gregory had dealt with Longobards at this time. Gregory was the one who was very close to the Langobard queen Theodolinda, who was a Bavarian. The Bavarians had been Catholic earlier than the Longobards. The Longobards weren't were Aryans, at least officially. Well, on in practice, they still were largely pagan, but the the Langobard aristocracy, in order to enter into the political play with the Romans and imperial power, had converted to Arianism, which at that point wasn't much a matter of the actual doctrinal differences, but it was like a flag to say we are Christians, but we're not Catholic as the Romans because we are Germans, and as Germans we we are Aryans, religiously speaking. Well, Gregory tried to the relationships between the Pope of Rome and the Longobards had been rough. At a certain point, the Longobards had even come to raid within the same Roman countryside. Were very tough times, but under Gregory the Great, and thanks to the mediation of this Queen Theodolinda, who was the wife first of the king Authari, who had raided the Roman countryside, in fact, and when she remained widowed, she married Agilulf, who was the Duke of Turin, who became eventually the king of the Longobards, and Agilulf was the first king, thanks to Theodolinda and Gregory, to convert to Catholicism. And in spite of certain uncertainties, up to a certain point, it's from that point onwards that the Longobards became fully Catholic. So meaning that that Gregory was skilled already at dealing with Germanic peoples. If, doesn't matter how different they could be, and dealing with the matters of evangelization. In the case of the Longobards, it was much easier because they were already Christian, at least, and they had already entered into the mindset of creating and maintaining a Christian kingdom. The Anglo-Saxons, as we will be seeing here, were relatively different. And Longobards kingdom was a very strong kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon England was still divided between the various these great quantity of kingdoms, certain greater, other minor, that however hadn't no unity in the 6th century. However, we should emphasize in this sense the diplomatic skills that Gregory had proved, and also the organizational ones, because what would happen with Anglo-Saxon England was also a matter, moving from Italy to England at that time, in the 6th century, in what is supposed to be some of the darkest hours of European history, and organizing the evangelization of a whole people. And as we were saying, Gregory emerges from a typical Romano-Italic frame. There is no doubt, both culturally, politically, socially. He was a Romano-Italic, definitely, and heir of that very ancient tradition of cultural tradition of the late Roman Empire that was still alive in these corners of Europe, that were still carrying out the memory of a classical past, and still having even if very strongly transformed, still a substantially late Roman society. And we can say that, however, there was still another influence in this in Gregory's background, that was the Eastern one, because and as we were saying before, it was quite important for from thinking at long range. The fact that he had been in Constantinople surely had put Gregory in contact even with the with Greek culture, with different views of the world, of Christianity, of the empire. And we can't think that he was surely enriched, and probably he made him think on in greater terms, in ambitions of imperial breadth, we can say, and not just as a very powerful Roman aristocrat. And it was a very long premise, half an hour, but it's very important to make you understand where the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxon really started from. And and we must say that there were actually two conversions of the Anglo-Saxons. The first one, it was successful, but it was rather fragile in some ways. And on the second place, this is the reason why it was tried, the evangelization in a second phase, from the Celtic Catholicism. As you know, Ireland and also parts of Western Britain had been Christian before that Anglo-Saxon England became. And this is the frame in which you understand that the various that these evangelizations took place. Anglo-Saxon England was divided between clashes between Northumbria and Mercia and all these other minor powers that made the situation still very fluid. By the way, we don't really know much about England, historically speaking, at that time, at least in comparison to Italy or to Gaul. Also because the social conditions were completely different. However, it's still important that in this frame, it was possible to build through the Irish model of evangelization, a net of centers that were at the same time of monastic culture and of ecclesiastical organization, let's say, according to the Irish model that, as we know, was based. I don't know. Maybe the Irish Church had been born in one of the few European areas that hadn't been conquered by the Roman Empire. And one of the characteristics of Ireland at that time is that it had no cities. They had a very strong Gaelic culture was proudly pagan. There was a lot of it was very difficult for the Christians to convert these people. And since there was no center of irradiation, because there weren't cities like in the rest of Europe that in which you could found a church, and the Irish didn't live that way. That they were all scattered clans that all lived on their own, so they were quite difficult to even organize. So the typical characteristics of Irish monasticism was that it was created into the countryside, and the same monasteries became the center of the dioceses, which meant that basically, while in continental in Christian in the rest of the Christian world, there was a city with a diocese and a bishop that ruled from there, and a bishop that had inherited the Roman administration substantially in the city district. The monasteries instead were scattered outside. In Ireland, instead, what you have is that the dioceses and the monastery are the same thing, or better. They are obviously still separated, but it's from the monastery that the bishops operate. within the rest, and to be in contact with the local population that in a certain part obviously eventually started to be converted. And therefore what happened in England is that in this second wave of evangelization that was coordinated with Rome, the Irish brought their own model of ecclesiastical organization. It was quite different from the Roman one, at least meant geographically speaking, because they were still Roman Catholics. And we and England was transformed by this evangelization. Um, um, and however, in spite of this Irish influence, in the Anglo-Saxon world didn't forget the first papal evangelization. It was a matter of prestige. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons, like all the originary Germanic people, the pagan Germanic people were quite pragmatic. We should get rid of this idea that the pagans, especially in Europe, I mean the Germanic area was so fiercely pagan that it couldn't be converted. Telling the truth, the Germans have always been, and Germanic peoples have always been in any age extremely pragmatic from that point of view. There was a very little resistance to conversion. Today, also for political reasons, we want to push, the idea of a substantial difference in characterization of the Germanic people, so keen on their pagan traditions, but when a political opportunity arose, they would be quite quick to change their fate, at least on the surface. And the fact that England had been firstly evangelized by the Pope was definitely a matter of prestige for the Anglo-Saxon kings. Also because they were so fiercely competing one with each other that everything that could reinforce their legitimacy and their authority in that mess that politically speaking Anglo-Saxon England was at that time was obviously quite immediately welcome. And what you see is that in this age, in the Gregorian age, meant the one of Gregory the Great, there was a great fealty to papacy in a lot of connections with Rome itself. And this was a very important time, exactly for what we were saying before, that that Rome had in that very moment an increase of the Greek Eastern presence in Rome from the eastern cities of the Mediterranean. That was caused essentially by and it has to be related with the monothelitic struggles, what we were talking about before, the controversies that Constantinople had with these localities for which, in the eastern provinces of the empire, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, a lot of heresies were spreading, and many people, especially the Orthodox one, that usually were the one closer, maybe, but not necessarily, but a lot of them started coming back from those areas, and then the Arab invasions came, and so a lot of refugees from these very wealthy and still educated places where the Hellenistic culture and the Roman culture had basically survived up to that point, flowed into Rome. And Rome had a very strong Greek and Eastern influence at that time, where there was a certain quarter was inhabited by the Greeks that you can still see. It's where the mouth of truth is in Rome today, but there were a lot of other communities there. In fact, also the Anglo-Saxon communities that started to form in Rome at that time. And it was surprising to me to know that from some certain Englishmen that some of them didn't even know about that. They didn't know that Anglo-Saxon lived in Rome, that were such strong contacts. I mean, this is such a fundamental chapter of European history, and I think it's so important to remember and to even in English identity. Not to look at that. And what happened in this sense is that a lot of these refugees that came from the eastern provinces were highly educated people, and they would be they would be aristocrats. They would be Roman aristocrats in the Roman universalistic and cultural sense of the word. So at the court of Pope Gregory the Great, these figures, these important figures, would be welcomed. These scholars or politicians or officers, and they would enrich the cultural environment of the papal court. And it's exactly from Rome in this sense that in 669, so we are late in time, but not so much considering what we're talking about today. The Greek monk Theodore was sent to Britain as Archbishop of Canterbury. He came. He was Greek, but he came from Cilicia. A lot of eastern. Cilicia is in today's Turkey. But a lot of those areas were inhabited by Greeks since ancient times, and Theodore, as Archbishop of Canterbury, was extremely important in giving the definitive mold to the Anglo-Saxon churches. I'm saying churches in plural because obviously the fragmentation of Anglo-Saxon England would bring to a difference. I mean, it was difficult. One thing is to have one kingdom, one empire, like you could have in Frankish Gaul or in Longobard Italy or in the Byzantine Empire, and giving an asset to an homogeneous organization, to a church. Another thing is to do it in Anglo-Saxon England, where you have at least 7 major powers that are fighting one against each other, and other minor entities that are trying to pursue their own their own interests, and between across these barriers, trying to form something homogeneous. Yet the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxon was so successful that at this point it was made possible to reorganize once again the Anglo-Saxon church. In which way? Well, we said that it was the Irish model that had basically been the one that gave the first immediate organization in the Anglo-Saxon church after the first papal attempt. Well, with Theodore, there was instead the reorganization of the Anglo-Saxon church according to the models, the Greek-Roman models, and therefore with a diocesan system settled on the cities. Britain had been modestly Romanized. There were still cities there. Some of them had disappeared. Obviously, Britain in the early Middle Ages is one of the places where the Roman influence within the ex-Roman territories was the weakest indeed, especially after the Anglo-Saxon conquest. But cities in some part were still there, and it's around them, or what remained of them, that the diocesan model was eventually built up according to the Greek Roman style, and not in the Celtic Irish fashion. However, it was the Irish influence didn't fade. Telling the truth, because there was no opposition in this. I mean, surely there was probably some, some debate, at least at a certain point. Um, in this reorganization, some Irish monk or bishop would have liked, the Irish model to continue. But there was really no opposition between Rome and Ireland. Also because Ireland had been, in this sense, successfully Christianized, in the sense that this monastic organization in Ireland and Western Britain was substantially strong and had to survive over time. So it was much easier, considering the geographical closeness for Rome, to deal with the Irish in order to control the development of the Anglo-Saxon church, which obviously from a certain point it wasn't, it was superfluous anymore. But, it was superfluous, but there was still a lot of influence of the Irish. Of the originally Celtic presence, and the papal ingerence, and there was definitely a convergence between also between the episcopal authority and the direction of abbeys. So in a certain measure, that relationship between bishop and abbeys that that at this time was, defined, because as we have seen in England, there were at least some cities and that were started to be the diocesan centers, and the monasteries to be something else. But the original Celtic influence was felt with a stronger contact than in other Christian lands in England, between the city bishops and the direction of the abbeys scattered in the territory. And what was important in this sense is that this process was supported by a very high level Greek Latin culture. I mean, there were obviously, the local clergy probably wasn't, that, educated, but let's say that the organizers really left a very strong mark, because Rome was quite interested about England, and its evangelization, and therefore the popes always sent very highly skilled personnel to deal with to organize the English church, and also in here you can feel, however, the Irish influence, meaning that the there was definitely an Irish culture that was definitely very important on its own, and that had managed to develop into Ireland in that time. It was essentially an aristocratic humanism, it's being called. Especially the Celtic monks coming from Ireland, as many of you probably already know, were still were quite Spartan in their lifestyle. They were quite austere, very harsh sometimes. Even think about the rules of Saint Columban, in the punishments of the body, the sufferance. Irish monasticism is something very, very tough, and it proved it to be also in its ability to convert both the Anglo-Saxons and other peoples in Central Europe later in time. So this Celtic tradition was conjugated instead with a very with a very strong theological experience, and also a very strong juridical and rhetorical experience as well. That was proper of Theodore, Archbishop of Canterbury, and of his collaborators, um, that was of Mediterranean origin, that were of Mediterranean origin, and therefore what you find was a very what I'm trying to say is that it was a very strong mix, and a very happy and successful one between these very strong evangelization, missionary-minded Celtic, Irish Celtic monastic tradition, and the coordination with the Church of Rome that always had its hand on this on the English Church at that time, which was a symbol of universal order. It was Rome herself that had evangelized the Anglo-Saxons, at least originally speaking, and that's what the Anglo-Saxon liked to remember. But at the same time, there was a very strong force that was that rendered it possible and had organized it and still influenced it, culturally speaking, that came instead from the Irish tradition. As we were saying before, this was evident because Anglo-Saxon England maintained during the early Middle Ages a very strong connection with Rome. It was a sort of common habit for Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, for instance, to go to Rome. They would make their own testament and leave, and normally would die. They wouldn't come back. Also because it was very tough journey, and they would come to Rome to see the tombs of Peter and Paul, and there was this idea of adventure. I don't know how the Anglo-Saxons perceived this, maybe from certain peculiar cultural traits of theirs, in which however, also Saint Columban probably played a very important role. You know how much he traveled, and the Anglo-Saxons being influenced, as we have seen, from the Celtic tradition, probably saw in him this man who had made it, who had walked so long, and had even entered in contact with Longobards, going to Italy, with the Pope, with different other peoples. So it was felt like kind of natural to go out there and into this enterprise and to go to Rome, for the salvation of their own soul and making donations to the church and strengthening the bond between England and Rome, and the apostolic seat, and we can say that this all of this was so important for English culture. Think for instance, very important figures, like Beda the Venerable, that really came culturally from this world. These monks, the illustrious monks that among which the most important was Beda, indeed, that between the 7th and 8th century were able to produce so much cultural works, cultural production in Anglo-Saxon England, and in the same work of Beda that had a huge influence within in all the Western Christendom, and already at that time um, on the European continent. And think of all the strong culture that you could you could find the extreme knowledge that was displayed by these men, and this was all thanks to that very strong cultural influence that came from the Mediterranean, and you see how the Anglo-Saxon completely mm, merged with it, at least in these in these figures that are so important in their history, and had an impact on the whole European culture. We're talking about exegesis, didascalic works, geographies, and even historical works. Um, in fact, think about Beta Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxons' history, and how that is important indeed for us today to understand such a difficult period in history like that, about which we have really a very few about it. If it wasn't for Beta, we would really be in the total obscurity, or almost at least. And how this proceeded and was so important, led and managed by the relationship that there was between Rome and Anglo-Saxon England. And this would obviously have the consequences that I was hinting at the beginning of the video, relatively to the role that Anglo-Saxon missionaries would later have especially into Carolingian Europe. And the evangelization of many peoples, especially in the very center of Europe, and the cultural importance that the Britain had for the Carolingian expansion, because these missions of evangelization in Central Europe, led by the Anglo-Saxons, weren't completely independent. They were still dependent from Rome. This is very interesting, meaning that you find figures like Boniface that wrote to the popes when converting the Frisians, the others, and said, "Can I do this? Can I do that?" And popes would answer them. And so you can understand how intimate was this relationship between the Church of Rome and one of England, and how this would happen at the same time in coordination with the Carolingians. They were in coordination with the Pope, and therefore the Carolingian military expansion and conquest of these pagan peoples was done in parallel with this evangelization. The same Carolingians, in part, strengthened the solidity of the Christian faith within the same Frankish lands through the Anglo-Saxons, and this influenced greatly the way these new churches and monasteries that were being built all over Europe, all over Central Europe, would develop and would be shaped. Sometimes we like to stress the differences between continental Europe and Britain, as if we had separate history, but it's not really the case. And the figures like Gregory the Great, who cared so much about the Anglo-Saxon conversion, and comforted it and organized it in accordance with the Irish, and this ability of the Anglo-Saxons to produce so much culturally thanks to that evangelization. This is what I think is striking, and how that came back on the continent. We are truly Europeans. We all come from that mold, and and the Anglo-Saxons played a really important role into this. They weren't at all a periphery of Europe. They were the very beating heart, and this is all thanks to all of to all of them, to all the people involved, to the Romano-Italic culture, the Eastern influxes, the Celtic monasticism, the will of the Anglo-Saxons to be converted and to enter into this game. So you see how we all played our part to make it possible, and this is what actually makes up us in our identity today. Maybe it was a bit messy and also a bit long because I've been speaking for an hour, but I hope so much that this chapter is clear. There is actually a lot to talk about this. There are also a lot of nice stories about this. What I care about, I think, it's very fascinating that in Rome there were Anglo-Saxon communities living next to the Romans, but also the Frankish communities, the Longobards communities, the Armenian communities, the Jewish communities, the Greek communities. How Rome was the core of this, and the Germans usually lived close to today's St. Peter's area, especially in front of the bridge that connects it to the Rome proper, on the left side of the Tiber river. It's also very fascinating with the episode when Gregory saw certain Anglo-Saxon slaves that had been taken to Rome, and he saw them, and he thought they were beautiful because they were blonde and blue-eyed, and he said, but these are not Angli, because Angli was the name of the Anglo-Saxons, or the Angles only. So these are not Angli but angels, he said, playing with the game. Because in Latin it's angeli and angli, so it had just to take out a e to make angli from angeli, and it's very, very fascinating and he wanted them to be freed and to be obviously converted because they were pagan. That's also very fascinating if you consider that, yeah, we were talking about Papal Rome. There was still slavery at that time. There was still a slave trade that could move from England to Rome. That is fascinating, and that makes you realize how still in the 6th century, that is supposed to be, especially in the second half, in the beginning of the 7th century, this sort of dark Europe where nothing moves, this sort of misery and nothingness. You find such a long-reach trade like the one of slaves from England, presumably considering the political map of the time between the same Anglo-Saxons enslaving each other, that came to sell their own slaves up to Rome. And that's amazing. That tells you how up to that time, even in the supposedly darkest hour, Europe was so interconnected, and that's what really makes me think. That's what we should all think when thinking about those days. We have very ugly prejudices towards the Middle Ages, let me tell you. So, I hope you enjoyed this very long video. And what can I say is that please, if you like this video, please share it. This is the biggest gift you can give me at the moment. Otherwise, just leave me a like or comment. And if you have any question, please contact me. I will be glad to answer your questions. Maybe perhaps even making a video response if you're interested. I can add interesting content through your questions. Let's put this community in motion, because this is what I really care about. So I thank you again for your attention. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.